I remember the day like it was yesterday, the day Sarah Davis, a kind woman who had done no wrong, became the victim of a system that never truly saw her. It was a cold evening, the kind where the wind cuts through your coat and chills you to the bone. But Sarah hadn't let the cold stop her. She had been out at a charity event, her heart as warm as ever, doing what she did best, helping others. That was Sarah's way. She had always been someone who would put others before herself, whether it was her work in the community or at home with her husband, John. John Davis was a retired FBI agent, the type of man who had seen it all and yet somehow still carried hope in his heart. I always admired that about him. After years of service, seeing the darkest corners of the world and facing evil head-on, he still believed in justice. He believed in the law, in the system. Maybe that's why what happened that night hit him so hard. Sarah was driving home after the event, a simple drive through a quiet neighborhood that should have been uneventful. But as fate would have it, blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror, pulling her from her thoughts. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't been doing anything wrong, and yet here they were, two police officers demanding that she pull over. Sarah was calm at first. She had nothing to fear. After all, she wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of a man who had spent his life upholding the law. But what Sarah didn't realize, what none of us realized at the time, was that the law didn't always see her the way it saw others. To these officers, Sarah wasn't a respected member of the community. She wasn't a woman who had just spent hours helping to raise money for children in need. To them, she was just another black woman, driving alone at night, and in their eyes that made her suspicious. The officers approached her car, and the situation escalated far faster than it ever should have. They accused her of speeding first, and then, before she knew it, the accusations turned into something far worse. One of the officers, Officer Adams, had the audacity to accuse her of being involved in a robbery that had happened earlier that evening. Sarah was stunned. A robbery? How could they think that? She had been at the charity event the entire night. She tried to explain herself, but they weren't listening. They didn't want to listen. I can only imagine the fear that began to creep into Sarah's heart as she stood there, under the harsh glare of the streetlights, while these men, these supposed protectors of the public, treated her like a criminal. They handcuffed her. Can you believe that? They actually put her in handcuffs. Sarah, a woman who had never so much as jaywalked, was now standing on the side of the road, cold metal digging into her wrists, all because two men decided she fit the description. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that she was innocent. None of that mattered to them. Sarah told them to call her husband. She told them that John could clear this up. After all, John had spent years working alongside law enforcement. He had the respect of his peers, and he knew how to navigate situations like this. But instead of listening, the officers laughed. They smirked at her. They mocked her. They didn't believe her. To them, she was lying, trying to weasel her way out of the consequences they had already decided she deserved. Back at home, John was sitting in his favorite chair, reading a book, when the phone rang. It was the kind of call that no husband should ever have to receive. The voice on the other end told him that Sarah had been arrested. Arrested! John couldn't believe it. How could this have happened? His mind raced as he grabbed his keys and rushed out the door. He didn't know all the details yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This was wrong. Whatever had happened, whatever mistake had been made, it needed to be fixed, and fast. When John arrived at the station, he expected things to be sorted out quickly. He thought that, once the officers realized who Sarah was, they would release her and apologize for the misunderstanding. But that's not what happened. Instead, John was met with hostility. The officers at the desk treated him with the same disdain they had shown Sarah. It didn't matter that John had spent years serving his country, risking his life for the very same people who were now treating his wife like a criminal. They didn't care. They had already made up their minds. I'll never forget the look on John's face when he walked into that station. He was a man who had always been in control, always been able to handle any situation thrown his way. But that night, he was powerless. He stood there, demanding to see his wife, but the officers ignored him. They brushed him off like he was nothing. And for the first time in his life, John realized what it felt like to be on the other side of the law, to be treated not as a person, but as a problem to be dealt with. When they finally let him see Sarah, she was sitting in a cold metal cell, her hands still cuffed. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She had never looked so small, so fragile. John knelt in front of her, his hands wrapping around hers through the bars. He tried to reassure her, but his voice shook with anger and fear. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't justice. The next day, John knew they had to fight. He wasn't just going to let this go. He wasn't going to allow these officers to get away with what they had done to Sarah. But he also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The system was stacked against them, and he was about to go up against the very thing he had spent his life defending. They hired Emily Johnson, a civil rights attorney who had made a name for herself taking on cases like Sarah's. Emily was smart, tough, and relentless. She wasn't afraid to go after the police, and she knew how to win. But even she warned them that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The police would do everything they could to protect their own, and Sarah's word alone wouldn't be enough to bring them down. They needed proof. As the case unfolded, the truth began to come to light. It turned out that the officers who had arrested Sarah had a history of racial profiling. They had been involved in several similar incidents, but none of the other victims had the resources or the connections to fight back. Sarah was different. She had John, and she had Emily. Together, they were determined to expose the corruption and bring these men to justice. The media caught wind of the case, and soon it was everywhere. People were outraged. Protests began to form outside the police station, demanding that the officers be held accountable. But even as the public rallied behind Sarah, the police department doubled down. They released statements defending the officers, claiming that Sarah had been uncooperative and that they had followed protocol. It was a lie, of course, but that didn't matter. The department was more concerned with protecting their own than doing what was right. John watched as his wife became the face of a movement he had never wanted to be part of. He had always believed in the system, believed that justice would prevail if you just followed the rules. But now he saw the cracks in that system. He saw how it failed people like Sarah every day, and he knew that something had to change. The trial was long and grueling. Emily fought tooth and nail, presenting evidence that showed the officers had no reason to arrest Sarah, no reason to treat her the way they did. She called witnesses who testified to the officers' history of discrimination. And through it all, Sarah sat in the courtroom, her head held high, refusing to be broken by the system that had tried to tear her down. When the verdict finally came, there was a collective breath held across the room. The jury found the officers guilty of misconduct. Sarah and John had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Yes, the officers had been held accountable, but the damage had been done. Sarah would never forget what it felt like to be treated as less than human, and John would never forget the helplessness he had felt that night in the police station. In the end, they used their experience to help others. Sarah continued her work in the community, but now she was also an advocate for police reform. John, too, found a new purpose. He began mentoring young law enforcement officers, teaching them the importance of fairness, respect, and justice for all. Together, they fought for a better future, a future where no one would have to endure what they had been through.